Tonight I'm going to talk about one of the more recent excavation projects I'm involved in. This probably isn't quite the title that I said, but it kind of captures things really. And the slide also makes the point that this project is a collaboration with a lot of people and a lot of different institutions. And all of these people have in one way or another fed into the results I'm going to talk about this evening. And there's also lots more still to be done. And so some of the results are quite provisional, or we're still waiting for things to happen as well. So I thought that what I'd really do is just take you through the project and where we are just now and some of our thinking about the significance of the discovery. Because ultimately, although the headline news tends to be about the Cursus monument, is very likely to be in this landscape in Drumadoon, I think actually the most important aspect of this project is the identification of a Neolithic farming landscape, which is surprisingly rare in Scotland, and is something that hopefully using lots of scientific techniques we can sort of unpick in the next few years. So we'll try to cover that this evening. Some of you probably heard me talk about this site before. Not everyone knows, so it's worth going back to where this really started for me, which was the discovery in 2017, 2018 of a putative Neolithic cursus monument by Hess as part of the big LiDAR survey they did on Arran. And during that survey, they found hundreds of sites that were previously unrecorded, partly testing and using artificial intelligence methods of interpreting the data. But this is one site that leapt out for them. There's a very lengthy pair of banks which runs north-south at Drumadoon, down in the southwest of corner of Arran near Blackwater Foot. I will show you many more images of the cursus, but this was something that was thought to be worthy of media coverage at the time, even by Hess, and he did a bit of a press release about the possible discovery of this Neolithic cursus monument. The discovery of an upland and a earthwork site is potentially very significant. And so that's something that caught my attention because I did my PhD on cursus monuments 20 odd years ago. So I'm always keen to have an opportunity to explore another site from this group, even though the survival of this site and its lack of recognition seemed almost too good to be true. This is the landscape that we've been working in, which is on Drumadoon. So that image is looking southwards, and you can just about see Blackwater Foot down by the coast. Those of you know this part of Arran. And the cursus is roughly marked out by this red dotted line on the air photo here that's just taken from a still from a drone film that was made by Ed O'Donnell. And really where we've been excavating so far is roughly towards the southern terminal, the end of the cursus, which is in a kind of area of gorse bushes. And it's worth emphasising this is a really challenging landscape to excavate in because it's very peaty, there's lots of difficult vegetation, it's waterlogged in places, and even just removing the topsoil when you're in some of these parts of the landscape is incredibly challenging and is almost a peat removal exercise. So it's actually been a physically very difficult excavation, and we haven't actually explored very much of the monument. Something like 1% of the monument so far I've managed to look at. And unless we actually start to use JCBs to dig into the monument, it's unlikely we'll be able to do much more than that because it's just too hard work. We keep breaking students, so it's just too much for them to keep spending weeks maticking through this massive monument. This is a bit more of useful illustration. The plan on the right there was produced by Hess in a few years after the LiDAR survey, and this was based on both the LiDAR data and also their field work. So they visited the site, they kind of walked along it, they tried to follow the bank. It's quite difficult to see on the ground, and they produced this plan which shows the cursus as a very wobbly rectangular enclosure with a sort of purpley blue boundary in the drawing in the plan. And the southern end where we've been working is down roughly where the excavations have been focused. And it's worth also noting in this plan, well, it's worth noting first of all that it's very wobbly, and that's exactly what we would expect from a cursus. Cursus monuments are by their nature quite irregular monuments, whether they're defined by ditches and banks or by timber posts. And I'll come back to defining what a cursus is in a few minutes. But these are very wobbly, irregular monuments, and so this fits quite well with that sort of morphology, even if this slightly upland location is rather unusual. The LiDAR was supplemented what we already knew about this landscape, which was one that had a dense coverage of Bronze Age farming sites. So there's hut circles, clearance cairns, and banks, and so on. and a suspicion that some of that stuff might be Neolithic, but that was unproven. And there's also other features that are of note here, including this incredibly straight and regular uh, plantation and rootway, which runs up and down the middle of the plan, which is a green line. And this is often mistaken for the cursus when people look at the images, but in fact, this is a much more recent landscape feature. And it's, as you can see, it's ruler straight, which contrasts with Neolithic architecture, which tends to be a bit more wobbly and all over the place. So there's a lot going on in this landscape, but the cursus is the sort of standout feature, and it's in a landscape that's already got huge potential, and there's already a place that's been looked at before by people like John Barber, Alison Haggerty, and so on at Mackery Moor, Mackery North, Tormore, and Torbeg, etc. In the 80s, in 1980s in particular. So on the ground, it's a very difficult monument to see. This is, I'm sure most of you recognise Gavin McGregor here, and this is during the Neolithic Studies Group visit in May last year, where actually the vegetation was low enough that we could more or less see the monument, because when you go here in the summer and the bracken is and the gorse is very high, it's actually incredibly difficult to make out where you are or understand the monument. So here Gavin's standing on the southern terminal of this earthwork enclosure, and the bank itself is actually quite substantial, but it's really not that difficult to see even in this photograph. So it's a challenging monument to see, and it's a challenging monument to get to, and it's quite difficult to excavate as well. So this is why the progress has been quite slow, I think, in terms of the actual investigation that we've done of this monument since we started in 2021. Okay, so before I start to look at the detail of the site, I just want to briefly talk about cursus monuments. So these are an unusual and relatively rare early Neolithic monument form, which is found across all of Britain and bits of Ireland as well, and is classically defined as a very large rectangular enclosure, usually defined by ditches and banks. But the earlier Scottish incarnations often were defined by timber posts. So they were wooden oak monuments, but then that seems to have morphed or evolved into these earthwork forms, which are more commonly found in southern England. And these can range in size anything from about a couple of 100 meters long to the largest, the Dorset cursus, which is 10 kilometers long. So some of these sites are massive and they're several kilometers in length. So first of all, they're big sites. They take up lots of landscape. They tend to be in lowland river valley locations, and we don't really have much of a sense of an exact clear function for the sites. I'm certainly not going to fall back on the ceremonial ritual cliche, but the sites that don't seem to have any mundane everyday function, and they may well have been gathering places for ceremonies. They may have been routeways that people formally processed along for a variety of different reasons. They may have been associated with funerary ceremonies, and they may have been routeways to join up different sacred points within the landscape. And they seem to have some kind of connection with waterways and rivers. So they're monuments that date to the 4th millennium BC. So there's about 50 in Scotland, and probably over 200 in Britain altogether. But they're still relatively little understood because they're such challenging sites to get to grips with, because even if you put a few big trenches through a cursus, you're often just scratching the surface, really. And most of these sites are also crop marks, like Hollywood on the right, which is a good indication of the scale of these monuments. You can see the village of Hollywood, which is north of Dumfries, right next to it, and also a major A road. And the cursus itself, as a crop mark here, is absolutely dwarfing it. So these sites are massive, but they're almost all ploughed out in the plough zone, and they only survive as crop marks, which is another challenging aspect of their interpretation. The thing that's really exciting about Drumadoon, and it's something that we kind of tried to emphasise when we did some media work last summer after the excavation, is that it's actually incredibly rare to have an upstanding earthwork cursus monument that we can explore in this way. There's very few examples in Scotland. As I said, there's over 50 cursus monuments in Scotland, and the only ones that survive as earthworks are the Cleven Dyke in Perthshire, which is a weird site anyway, which has got a single central bank, and I was involved in the excavation of that as a student back in 1994-95. And then the other site on the left here is at Melbourne Crossroads in South Lanarkshire, which is very close to Elsrickle, and it runs for 2.5 kilometres between two different hilltops over a valley. And the thing that's quite exciting with this site is that it's been known for a long time that these earthworks existed here, but they were always assumed to be early medieval or later prehistoric field boundaries. It was only when someone actually started to join the dots that they realised this was a massive earthwork enclosure with an external bank and external ditch and internal bank. And so about 10 years ago, it was reinterpreted by Strathearn at Hess, or formerly the Royal Commission, as being a possible cursus. And they did some geophysics, but there's more work that could be done at this site, and it's another potentially exciting target for understanding these kind of sites. So only two of the 50 sites that were known had any upstanding earthwork components. So the opportunity afforded at Drumadoon is to actually put a trench through one of these sites and start to understand the formation of the bank. Because ultimately we've got lots of cursus ditches because they survive as crop marks, but the banks are what we don't have surviving anymore. So initially this was quite a small scale project with Gavin McGregor, who was at the time at Northlight Heritage, and working with David Bennett, who's the landowner at Drumadoon, who's actually in the picture on the left, in the green t-shirt doing some excavating. And David's very keen to explore the potential for rewilding of his estate. And so he sees a better understanding of Neolithic farming practices and prehistoric activity in the landscape as a way for him to think about how to manage the landscape going forward. So he was very supportive of us going there and doing a bit of work. And so we just did a bit of a trial trench in 2021, which ran across the Cursus bank towards the southern terminal. It was a very small trench and it was far too small because the bank was much bigger than we imagined. At first, we thought it was maybe 3 or 4 meters across because it's so difficult to see on the ground. But in reality, it was much, much bigger. And it also had a very complicated stone component, which we didn't really understand. So after a few days of just poking about, we decided to stop and cover the trench back up again and then come back with a bigger team the following year. So in 2022, we came back with, this time it became our field school at Glasgow Uni. And so we brought over a team of about 18, 20 students. And we also had the kind of more formal involvement of Archaeology Scotland, where Gavin had moved to, and also Leslie McFadgen from Birkbeck was up there as well. And we started to also invite people like Emma Jenkins to come up and start to do some environmental recording, along with Nikki Whitehouse, who's the head of department in Glasgow, who's an environmental archaeologist. So we took a big chunk out of the cursus, but also there was a lot of environmental sampling done in the wider landscape. And I'll come back to the environmental and landscape context once I've discussed what we found at the cursus. So this just shows that the trench had gone up a gear. We'd opened a much bigger trench across the whole of the bank. And this maybe starts to give you a sense, this photo, of how substantial the bank actually is, because you can see the students down in the bottom right are down towards the external side of the bank, and then the team are in the middle are standing in the top of the bank, and then it dips over the other side. And then you've got to also imagine again that this is only 1% of the bank if you take the whole monument as a whole. So this has got the potential to be a giant monument with an enormous level of effort and labour that went into constructing it. And the corollary of that is that it's an absolute nightmare to excavate, because we're essentially dismantling what's a very substantial structure that's been there for thousands of years and has settled in, and is very difficult to deal with. So in this first big main season in 2022, we started to immediately come across quite surprising aspects of the monument, including a lot of rhyolite stones that were on, especially common on the inside side of the bank, but there was also some on the outside of the bank as well, and various different aspects of collapse that we couldn't quite make sense of. But essentially, just by even opening this trench in 2022, we started to realise that this was a complicated ditch that had elements of turf and probably of topsoil, but also a really complicated stone component as well. And it was difficult to work out whether the stone was added later on as a capping for the bank, perhaps for stability, or whether it was an initially important part of the construction. And there was also various aspects of collapse and disturbance that we couldn't quite make sense of. So it was a really difficult site to get to grips with. And again, even in the second season, the bank was much bigger than we thought it would be. It was much deeper, so we couldn't get to the end of the trench before the end of the season. And we went down about a metre, and we were still coming down on different layers of bank. So we took lots of cubienitin samples, recorded what we had at that point, and then we had to fill the whole thing back in again, rather depressingly. to come back for another season in 2023. One thing that we were able to explore a bit in the 2022 season was the interior of the cursus to an extent. So when you start to look beyond the edge of the bank on the inside of the monument, we started to come across a few cut features. Most of these turned out to be animal burrows, but there was one of two probably small pits, some of which had charcoal in them. So there's evidence of maybe small scale activity happening within the site, but this is a tiny, tiny sample of a really vast interior space, because the monument itself is about 50 meters wide between the banks, as well as being about 1 kilometer long. So this is a really huge enclosed space, and this is not even scratching the surface of how big that is. But there's potential for stuff to be found in the natural, which is useful because that's where we might find interesting things. And some of this was starting to be buried beneath peat as well. And even then, we started to realise the bank was a bit bigger than we thought because of various different processes like podulization, and it just became very difficult to really make sense of things, so we had to stop for the end of that season. One thing that was really encouraging, though, was that we found quite a lot of lithics within the bank of the monument itself, and it's very likely that these relate to the construction of the monument, in the sense that to create this bank, they probably deturfed and scraped up topsoil over a vast area of this landscape, possibly not just the interior of the cursus, but beyond that as well, to create this bank. And so when they did that, any lithics that were in the topsoil were being gathered up and then accumulated into the cursus bank. And this suggests this is not material necessarily related to the cursus itself, but related to the use of this landscape before the cursus was built. So, and we had an interesting mixture of different stone sources. Of course, we found Arran pitchstone with various different blades and fragments, and that would be almost certainly originate in the Neolithic. But we also found this incredible flint spear tip, or perhaps a large scraper, which you can see from the scale is about 6 centimeters long and made from flint from Antrim. And there was also some microliths as well, which suggest a kind of background of Mesolithic activity within the landscape as well. So we're seeing here a landscape that before the cursus was constructed, was being used for lithic manufacture back to the Mesolithic periods. And we have the importing of material from Antrim, but also we have the local Arran pitchstone being used as well. So there's a really nice assemblage of stuff that we found. And in fact, we didn't really find as much in the last season, unfortunately, to match this really nice selection of stuff that we got in 2022. But it was enough to keep the students excited and keep their eyes open, because pitchstone's quite difficult to see when you're digging in murky soils. So we left at the end of 2022 with a trench we still hadn't bottomed, and a sense that we had to try to really understand the sequence in its entirety. And so we went back in 2023 and opened the same trench for a third, and it had to be the final time because no one could face having to reopen this trench again. And we also expanded it slightly in terms of length, and we also again had a big team in 2023, and we also had a program of local volunteers and community helpers coming along as well, so we could break them as well once we'd broken the students, doing all the heavy work and the matticking. And you can see also this is just a wonderful place to work up on the moor with Goatfell and the mountains to the north. And we were blessed with surprisingly good weather more or less all of the time on this site. It was in a bit of a rain shadow, so it very rarely ever rained across any of our seasons of work at this site. And also the other thing that was amazing is there was almost no problems with midges either, because there was always a little breeze coming in off the sea. So there was only one day, I think, where we had any insects on site. So it was actually a really perfect place to excavate, apart from all the back-breaking matticking and hard work that had to be done. So anyway, the plan there shows the southern end of the cursus and the location of some of the trenches that we put in. Trench 1 was the one that we worked on for all 3 seasons. Trench 2 was a small trench we opened in the wrong place in 2022. And Trench 3A was opened in 2023. 3B we didn't manage because it was so grim, opening up Trench 3A, that we decided not to do any more there. So quite a bit more work being done. And this was the result really in terms of our understanding of the bank. This is now the bank exposed fully after we completed and bottomed the trench finally after another week of hard work, down to this kind of orange subsoil you can see in the bottom of the trench. And it reveals this really complicated, probably multi-phase bank, which is really big, 8 to 10 meters across, about 1.3 meters high at the middle point, consisting of a real mixture of different layers and deposits. Lots and lots of orangey silts that are mixed up in redeposited topsoils and turfs, but also frequent stone deposits, which seem to be almost structural in places, whether it be the rhyolite capping that I mentioned that we found in 2022, or a really substantial piece of tumble and collapse down in the exterior of the cursus on the left-hand side of the image, because you're looking here southwards, so the left is the outside of the bank, the right is the inside of the bank and the cursus interior. And you've got this tumble down towards the left-hand side, which almost had the quality of a wall. And we also found other sort of little rickles of stone that looked as if they might have been walls or low stone features running through the landscape. So it's possible that when the cursus was constructed, there already were pre-existing features in the landscape. They may have been field banks or field walls that the cursus then augmented or else was built on top of and then kind of swamped. Or it may be that there are stone components to the monument that we can't quite understand. And so this was again an indicator that this is a monument that has got an absolutely massive structural form because it's huge, and it's also got this stony element which makes it even more confusing. But also, this is a site that its construction must have completely and radically transformed the whole of this landscape, because they would have had to de-turf and de-topsoil everywhere, and they would have been gathering up thousands of stones from different local quarry points and so on to create this site. So this was a massive building project that I suspect probably took many years to complete, depending on how they actually organise the labour. And it may well be that this extended construction process is why the monument's got such a wobbly boundary, because it was built over by different teams over perhaps many, many years. But it represents a huge amount of effort to create this rather complicated mound. And this gives a sense of the challenge of some of the excavation here. This is us sort of starting to get down to the basal levels of the bank. And one of the earliest levels appear to be a stony deposit, which seems to have been used to level the landscape here. So the whole bank is built on a thin layer of local stones, which then in turn has all these other layers added on top of it. So it's got a very solid base, and it's also got these other stony components which have held it together, which is why it's actually held together so well in the landscape. Also, it's the advantage of not really having ever been subject to modern agriculture. So therefore, it hasn't been damaged in the same way as almost every other cursus has been. But this was a site that was really challenging to excavate, and it wasn't a lot of fun at times. But the students did a fantastic job with all of the helpers we had on site as well. One thing that we wanted to explore was whether there was a ditch with this monument. So cursus monuments have usually got a bank and then a ditch on the outside, and the ditch is essentially the quarry location for the bank material. But we looked very hard and we couldn't find any evidence for a ditch anywhere. At least at this area of the monument, we can't sort of speculate as to what might be happening elsewhere. But there didn't seem to be a ditch, which reinforces the idea that the monument wasn't created by quarrying a ditch, but it was created by gathering up in tops and de-turfing the whole landscape to create the bank. So they didn't need to dig a ditch because they had the soil, that they had the material for that. They could just scrape off the surface. The area of stone that was down there, we weren't quite sure what was going on. We thought first it was a wall, and then maybe it was a collapsed standing stone or broken standing stones or something like that. And perhaps it was stone material that was on top of the bank that fell off and tumbled down to the side. So it was quite difficult to make sense of these really stony deposits. I think that probably the most likely explanation is that we have got these kind of wall-like structures that are part of the monument structure to hold it together. So on the exterior of the bank on the downhill side, there's a kind of stones that are holding the bank together, and then on the other side they've got the kind of more of the rhyolite flat layer of stones, which is again adding stability. But the stone seems to be an important structural part of the monument, and this is important because is this representative of other cursus monuments? Do other cursus monuments, did they have stone components within their banks? Because they've all been ploughed flat, it's very difficult to tell. So this might be unique, or it might be telling something about the complex way these monuments were constructed. But yeah, there was a lot of stonework to deal with here. We did, as I mentioned, there was a couple of other trenches that we opened just to try and confirm a few other elements of the site as well. Trench 2, as I said, was opened in 2022. We opened it in the wrong place. But as it happened, we came down right on the middle of the bank, and it confirmed the sequence that we had on the other main trench of a kind of orangey, topsoily, turfy type central construction of the mound with stony components on either side. And we also found a lot of disturbance in the upper level of the bank here, which is almost certainly caused by peat cutting. So this is a landscape that was being utilised into the post-medieval period for peat as well. The other trench 3, we opened to explore possible geophysical anomaly, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But ultimately, it just became an exercise in pain, because even opening this small trench took days and days of removing massive turfs, big lumps of peat, and every time it rained, it rained really heavily on a day off, and it flooded the whole site, and it had to be sponged out again. But in the end, again, we were able to come up with a similar sequence. You can see here, this is looking eastwards across the cursus to the exterior of the monument, and we've got this same kind of rhyolite capping or flat layer on that side of the trench, beside the recently broken students who did a lot of the work here along with some of our volunteers. So this was a really challenging bit of the site to excavate, and it made us realise that actually just going out and opening up trenches is not necessarily going to be feasible going forward to investigate this monument. So it's quite difficult to really explore even small areas without huge amounts of labour, which is not ideal. So the archaeology here is pointing to some kind of massive monument that would have involved a huge amount of labour and perhaps time to construct, and it probably was quite spectacular when it was initially constructed. One quality that the rhyolite has is it's got a lot of quartz crystals in it, and it's quite shiny. And so we can imagine a scenario, should we extrapolate the discovery in this one small area of the bank along the whole monument, it may well be that the whole of the monument's banks was capped on both sides with this rhyolite band. And this would have been bright, and it would have caught the sun, and it probably would have been quite like a bright silvery grey streak across the landscape, replicated here in this wonderful graphic. And so this is interesting to me because if the cursus monuments that are found in the south of England, the big ones like the Stonehenge Greater Cursus, the Dorset Cursus, are cut into chalk landscapes in some cases, and so they would have appeared when they were initially cut as white parallel lines across the landscape. And it does make me wonder to what extent there's a similar effect has been achieved here by the use of this rhyolite capping. So it may well be that was an entirely aesthetic element to the interior of the bank that was added to the monument to give it this really bright appearance, that may have been partly about impressing people who visited the site, but may also have been making some kind of visual reference or connection. Cursus monuments elsewhere in Britain at the same time. Or it could just be a coincidence or just me over-interpreting the information. So, but it's an exciting discovery, and already it's been really fantastic to just have had a chance to dig through a cursus bank, because it's a very rare opportunity you have in your career to do that. I've been lucky enough to have been involved in 2 cursus bank excavations now, but this is shedding light on potentially on the way that some of these monuments were constructed, not by quarrying material from a ditch, but by deturfing the landscape. And this again is a process that was identified by Gordon Child when he excavated at the Ladies Long Barrow in Aberdeenshire, where the monument there appeared to be more or less constructed by turf, and he worked out that the whole area was deturfed to create this long barrow. So this is very much like terraforming. They were absolutely transforming and changing this landscape, removing vegetation and topsoil to create this specific effect, this routeway through the landscape. And I'll come back before we finish to just think a bit more about how that might have operated. But the thing that was quite exciting was we got lots of media coverage about uncovering a huge Neolithic monument, the most complete cursus monument ever found, and various things which may or may not have been things that I said to journalists. But essentially, it was nice to have a bit of coverage because you don't often see cursus monuments mentioned in the media. So the excavations, I think, well, there's more to be done, but even the limited work that we've been able to do has been really interesting in terms of shedding light on quite a complicated earthwork. And and although we still don't have any dates yet, the radiocarbon dates are still to come in, and it's not definitive. I'm fairly convinced that it is a Neolithic monument through to due to its morphology, its location, and some of the things we've been finding in relation to it. And we haven't found anything at all associated with the monument that's later, which again is a positive sign. So I'm more confident it's a cursus than I was a year ago after our 2022 season. The other thing that was really interesting that was carried out before we started doing the excavation was a geophysical survey by HES. And again, it's very challenging to do geophysical surveys in this landscape. But this bit of work was done in August 2021, just a few weeks after our excavation, I think, in fact. And they looked at the area both where we excavated, we didn't really find very much, but they also looked at an area to the north, which is a kind of a square box on the plan of the cursus. And that's where we put Trench 3A in 2023. Now, one of the things that they found here was a series of anomalies that ran parallel to the bank of the cursus on the interior of the monument. So in that plot here from the geophysics, the one that's got colour on it, the red line that runs north up and down through the image is where the cursus bank was being picked up with the stone component. But then there's some yellow blobs to the inside of that, which may have been anomalies which may represent pits or post holes. Now, this is exciting because there are a few cursus monuments in Scotland that I have tentatively called hybrid cursus monuments that have got elements of both timber and earthwork components. The best example being Hollywood North, where I also excavated when I was a student back in 1997. And this is a cursus that started off life in the early Neolithic as a timber monument, a timber rectangular enclosure with rounded ends. And then at some point in the 4th millennium BC, it was replaced by an earthwork version with a massive ditch. And the bank here has been ploughed flat. And there are other sites like Blair Hall in Perthshire, which has got the transcription on the slide there, which I think maybe were sites that had a timber component, although that's a bit more speculative because I'm just working on the crop mark and the site morphology. So it could well be that the cursus at Drumadoon had a timber component in its first incarnation, and that's been picked up on those geophysical anomalies. But the challenge to actually find them during excavation is really what we're trying to get to grips with, because the Trench 3 was trying to find these anomalies and we didn't have any success. But hopefully we can try and resolve that in the future and go back and see if we can work out whether it did have a timber component, because that'd be incredibly exciting to find a timber predecessor to the massive earthwork and stone monument that we found, which would suggest that this was a routeway or a line through the landscape that was marked in multiple different ways and materials over many centuries, which is very exciting. We did some geophysics in 2023 as part of the project. Darko, in the picture here, heroically did magnetometry across a large area to the east of the cursus, across this really unpromising landscape, and also worked with our students doing resistivity survey around the terminal of the cursus monument, which involved them removing lots of bracken and doing lots and lots of little grids in this area, just expanding his area out as he found a few more bits and pieces. And the survey, in terms of his understanding of the results, and I have to say, I suspect there's a bit of overinterpretation going on here, but nonetheless, he felt that at the southern end of the cursus, there was quite a lot of anomalies which he thought were interesting and worthy of further exploration. One of which was located more or less where the cursus terminal bank curves round, which he felt was indicative of perhaps a stone structure, maybe a kist or something, which is what he was just speculating from the geophysics. That's not impossible because we do have cursus monuments that have got burials inserted into the monuments, sometimes at the terminals, like the Thornborough cursus in Yorkshire. So it could well be that there is some kind of burial that was added later on into this monument at the terminal. And he was also able, through the geophysics, to pin down where the eastern bank of the western bank, sorry, of the cursus is at the terminal area, because it's very, very difficult to see on the ground. So this geophysics has suggested that there's actually some stuff going on in this landscape that we can't see on the surface, and that will require a bit of ground truthing going forward. So that's something that we're going to explore in the future as well. Now, I have to steel myself for the science. So what the environmental archaeology side of the project, which Nikki and Emma have been running with lots of other friends and colleagues, has taken a real kind of a methodological approach. And actually, some of the approaches are really quite innovative and new and fresh, and so they're potentially going to shed light on the landscape in terms of what was the environment like, what were people doing, what was happening in this landscape in prehistory, and how does a cursus fit into that picture? Because we tend to see cursus monuments as ceremonial monuments that sort of sit in isolation in landscapes that were abandoned or not used for anything except for whatever happened at cursus monuments. But what we have at Drumadoon is a cursus that's clearly situated within a later prehistoric farming landscape. But the question is there something earlier happening? Do we have farming happening in a Neolithic period? And how does that relate to the cursus? And how does that help us understand what cursus monuments may have been about, or at least what this site was about? Because it may have been actually situated within a farming landscape, and that'd be an incredibly exciting discovery. This big screen grab here of the LiDAR is really just to reinforce the point that the LiDAR didn't just pick up the cursus monument. It picked up a whole range of other features, many of which had never been discovered before. Lots and lots of field banks and hut circles and clearance cairns and so on, humps and bumps. You can see that kind of straight-sided droveway or routeway running up and down top to bottom of the image as well to the left of the cursus. And so you can see the really granular level of detail that the LiDAR gives you. And it does, of course, LiDAR doesn't interpret what these things are, but it shows you there's something there, and then you have to actually go in and make sense of it. So we may have, for instance, hut circles within the cursus, which is something that's really exciting, worth exploring. And it also starts to shed light on the relationships between different earthwork features. So the cursus southern terminal is very much within this kind of group of farming features, including a field bank, which is noted here. The number or the lettering FB1 next to this is a trench that I'm going to talk about in a few moments, which we excavated first in 2022. And there's also an area of clearance cairns around there as well, which we've been thinking about exploring. So there's a lot going on in this landscape. It's really densely occupied, and the LiDAR's helping us to pull that apart. In fact, a few months ago, Darko produced this incredible plan where he did a bit of an interpretive exercise looking at the LiDAR data to pull out a lot of information. So in this image, the cursus is shown as a kind of the red wobbly linear feature running top to bottom of the image. The green he's interpreted as being Bronze Age fields and field systems and settlement traces. Some of that might be Iron Age, though. Some of it might be Neolithic, which would be very exciting. The black dots are all clearance cairns, and there's also lots of hut circles as well, which he hasn't added into that drawing there. And the other thing which situates this, and some of you may be aware of these features, are the Drumadoon Iron Age Hill Fort, which is down in the bottom left of the image here, which is quite a really substantial monument, and also the King's Caves, which are notable for lots of carvings, some of which may be prehistoric, but there's a collection of medieval carvings in that cave as well. There's a lot going on in this landscape, and all of this is owned by David Bennett, the landowner at Drumadoon. The thing that most interested me in this image, and it's maybe you don't pick up on it initially, is the fact that Darko suspects that there may be a double terminal happening in the middle of the cursus. So in that middle bit, where halfway up the cursus, he actually thinks there may have been two terminals of two cursus monuments abutting each other, and this is actually a two-phase cursus. And this reminds me very much of the Dorset cursus, where you've got one initial cursus monument, and then a second one is abutted on and added to extend it further for another few kilometres. So it's possible the LiDAR is hinting at the fact that this is not necessarily even one cursus, but it's two cursus monuments abutted on one end to the other, and that's not impossible. And that area where they've got that potential double bank is definitely worthy of further explanation, although it's absolutely nightmarish walking to even that place, never mind going there with spades and shovels and all the rest of it. But something to focus on in the future, perhaps. Field Boundary 1, this is 2022, not 2023, which I've got the wrong date there, was opened by Darko really in 2022, just to explore this possible field bank that was picked up by LiDAR. It runs over towards the cursus, probably is later than the cursus in terms of the stratigraphical relationship. And Darko found that it was constructed of different rounded boulders that were not the same as the flat rhyolite stones that were part of the cursus bank. And he also found a Bronze Age lithic within the matrix of the the field bank as well. So it's likely this is a Bronze Age field bank, but it's enclosing and covering potentially earlier soils which may have been cultivated, and various Cubiena tins were taken and samples were taken from that trench from 2022, and that was the focus of a lot of the environmental work in 2023. So this is some of the analysis that was done from this year was from the 2022 trench in field boundary 1 was a soil micromorphology, which I mean I think it's just basically looking at the soil through a microscope. That's maybe that simple. And that was really informative in the sense that it started to suggest that the soils that are here in this area have been cultivated, manipulated by humans. You can see from the notes in this slide, which is prepared by Emma and Nikki, that we've actually got bits of fragments of charcoal within these samples, and also other elements of these being mineralized soils and soils that have been manipulated by humans. So these are farmed soils and very likely prehistoric. So there's hints here that we've got a landscape that's really been manipulated, perhaps manured, and the soils are made more productive by human activity, which is what we would expect to happen in prehistory. So that's really tantalizing. Emma's also been looking at soil phytoliths, which I now consult my notes, are rigid microscopic structures made of silica, which are found in some plant tissues and persist after the decay of the plants. And these essentially can provide information about the environment and changes in the environment at the time that these plants were being used. So this is a really complicated scientific technique that's going to help us to understand different aspects of the vegetation history in this landscape and how that's changed through time as well. And the phytolith work is already starting to shed results in terms of looking at the different changing patterns in the landscape from pasture to more wild aspects of what's going on here. So I'm not going to say much more at this slide because I don't really understand most of it, but suffice to say that by looking through microscopes, we can start to understand the environmental history of the landscape here. And that's really one of the key things that we're trying to do in this environmental side of the project. And lots of samples were also taken in 2022 from the main trench. We did loads and loads of Cubiena tins, and these again produced through the micromorph work some really intriguing suggestions that this is a manipulated farmed soil. So there's possibly tiny fragments of broken down pottery or fired clay, charcoal, and various other things, which again suggest this is a soil that's been manipulated by humans, and humans have had a hand in doing things to it. Now, bear in mind that this is from the bank of the cursus, so therefore, again, these are pre-cursus soils that must have been farmed. People were doing things here, and then it was all scraped up and used to construct the cursus monument. So essentially, we're looking at a monument that's made of soils that were created by farming in this landscape. So that's an incredibly exciting observation that's been made through even the initial analysis of these samples from 2022. Oh, we've got a wee video here. I hope this works. So the other methodology, apart from all of this kind of Cubiena tins and the other samples that are here, are also exploring within the wider landscape. And this is a real fun process. Let's see if the video works. Look at that. So this is a couple of the team members taking a core from out in the Drumadoon landscape. And you can see this is really, again, quite physically demanding, but they can produce from that very deep cross sections through the soil, which can then be explored, characterized using the dreaded Munsell charts. But also you can then start to do things like radiocarbon date and analyze these soils as well. That tells you things about the depth of topsoil, but also one of the things that's been shedding light on in part of the project is is peat accumulation in the area as well, and you can identify areas where there's more and less peat and so on. So that's being used as a sort of survey technique within the wider landscape, and that area will be expanding in 2024. In 2023, within the field boundary trench was expanded and deepened, and as you can see here with Becca Bartley of Archaeology Scotland, we've got a lot more Cubiena tins being taken in samples, and those are being looked at and processed just now. And we also had a load of other scientific techniques and things that were thrown at this site as well. And we had a team coming up from Southampton, some other researchers who are based in Tromsø coming over to do various different techniques, including, and you can see the list on the slide, SEDA DNA, pollen and phytolith studies, leaf waxes, and biomarkers. Now, SEDA DNA is an incredibly exciting new technique that where we can extract DNA from sediments. And essentially, this DNA will tell you if anything living has been in association with those soils and sediments. So, for instance, if you have a lot of cattle in a location in the Neolithic period, then they will leave behind their kind of their DNA in various different forms, and that can be radiocarbon dated. And we can all and you can also analyze the genetic data to work out whether it's actually a cow that was around a long time ago, or whether a cow just walked over last week and did a pee on the monument. So they assure me they can differentiate between DNA samples from animals and plants that are modern as opposed to those that are more ancient. And all those little kind of funny plastic test tubes are all said of DNA samples taken through the whole of the profile of the cursus bank. Leaf waxes. Leaf waxes is a form of extracting lipids and fats from plants, and they can be used as a proxy for environmental information. So someone's analysing that as well from different samples. And biomarkers relate to the cellular structure of plant remains, which can tell you things about periods of stress that plants have undergone, which relate to the landscape change or climate change, for instance, drought, periods of drought and so on. So these are the kind of samples that are being taken and analysed. Most of the results are not back yet, but they are being processed in various different labs around Northwest Europe. Here we also have more samples being taken, multi-elemental analysis. I have to say I Googled ITRAXX and I can't find anything. I can't find what on earth it means. So I've got no idea what that means. So if anyone knows what ITRAXX analysis is, then please do let me know. But the other things that we're also using are XRF, X-ray fluorescence scanning, which can pick up elemental aspects of the sites, the soils and so on, and also OSL dating, which is the luminescence dating, looking at the last time that crystals, sediment crystals were exposed to light. And I think a few OSL samples were taken as well. So there's a lot of science has been thrown at this. A lot of organisations and partners are doing stuff on a kind of an experimental basis that will give us useful results for the project, but also will help them test techniques as well. And so a lot of these are quite groundbreaking. So in particular, the SEDA DNA with all these little holes that were taken through the cursus bank, the analysis of that being done by Professor Tony Brown at Tromsø are starting to yield results, which I have been sent the results, but I don't understand them because there's just lots of diagrams with colours on them. But essentially, the headline discovery so far is that in the field boundary trench, the SEDA DNA analysis is suggesting a series of different cultivated soil horizons, which probably relate to pre-cursus activity. So again, all of the environmental analysis we've done so far, all of the sampling we've got so far is all pointing to the fact that this was a Neolithic farming landscape, both with animals and potentially with crops being grown as well. And these are really significant discoveries because, as I said already, it's actually very rare to find real physical traces of Neolithic farming. There's only about 20 instances across all of Scotland where we find field manipulated soils, field boundaries, plough marks that are probably Neolithic. Quite a few of them are Arran, including at Macri Moor. And I think that this is potentially one of the most significant Neolithic farming landscapes that we can understand and know in Scotland. So I think that this actually, the cursus is the headline, of course, but actually underlying that, we've got some really incredible kind of microscopic level information, which is really helping us to understand what people are doing here on Arran. Arran seems to have been a very rich agricultural landscape in the Neolithic period that then seems to have become a place where ceremony monuments were being constructed, and there may be a connection between the two trends. Oof. I'm not going to go into any detail here other than the fact to say that Nicky got funding for 29 radiocarbon dates, and we're processing and getting the samples together for that to happen in the coming months. And again, this is not just everyday normal radiocarbon dates, but also some dates are being taken using the ramped oxidation technique, which explains on the slide what that means. But essentially, it's giving us other opportunities for dates from our samples. And these samples will, of course, give us a good sequence, and hopefully we can do some Bayesian analysis as well. And this will also help to ground truth and to kind of give a structure to all of the environmental samples that are being taken too within the landscape. So what we've got here then is a really kind of stable landscape, which has really worked in our favour, because it probably, apart from the peat development in Drumadoon over the last few thousand years, it's probably a landscape that hasn't changed very much since the cursus was abandoned in the middle Neolithic. It's a landscape that was farmed extensively in prehistory, But now we couldn't really farm up here. It's just now wild land with deer running across it. There's no farming up here happening at all as such, and with a few forestry plantations. So we've got a stable landscape that is not really been touched by modern farming, and in fact has got a future of being a rewilded landscape as well, which is in keeping with the prehistoric legacy of this bit of the landscape, which is why David Bennett, the landowner, is so excited about this. But what I've also got is a monument in a landscape that's really in a key area in the Shiskin Valley. And this image here is taken from the south of the cursus. The cursus starts a bit further to the north in this image, but the cursus itself would have ran through this landscape and then broken the horizon line roughly where the red arrow is, which is just next to a modern forestry plantation. And if you actually walk up there, you gradually move up a slope further and further up until suddenly you get to the top of the slope there, the cursus would have ended, and then you would have had this vista of mountains in front of you, but also Machrie Moor. So you've got a cursus monument that seems to be right in the thick of it. It's actually structuring and stage managing the experience of this landscape. And by walking along the cursus, you're connecting up these really important experiences. So I think, sorry, there's some really rubbish illustrations here, but essentially, there's a real sense, I think, growing that the Shiskin Valley was a really important place in the early to late Neolithic. A major ceremonial centre, which had a whole suite of different monuments which suggested connections and traditions from other parts of northern Britain and beyond. So as well as having the cursus, there's also all of the sites in Machrie Moor, which I'm sure most are familiar with the earlier Neolithic timber circles and settings and structures, then followed by a period of ploughing and aardmarks, and then the construction of the incredible stone circles there in the early Bronze Age. But there are other things in this landscape too as well. For instance, a few years ago, in advance of the construction of houses in Blackwater Foot, Tom Rees uncovered the one part of a 100-metre diameter timber circle with lots of grooveware pottery associated with it. So we've got a really big timber feature right down at the harbour at Blackwater Foot. And then there's also other features within the landscape, maybe a hilltop enclosure that could be Neolithic, a few megalithic tombs around, that suggests that this was a really important place. But not just a place of monumentality, a place where people were farming on an everyday basis, and people were probably living in this area as well. And the one thing that we're missing, and that Leslie McFadden's been looking for, is where were people living at this time? Because a lot of the activity around here was probably related to pilgrims or people coming to Arran, perhaps to visit this place, but also to get a bag of Arran pitchstone and take it away as a wee souvenir. But actually, there would have been people here farming this landscape, living here as well, building the monuments. And we haven't yet found any evidence whatsoever of where these people are living in this particular part of Arran. There's a possible Neolithic house was found on the String Road, which some of you may know on the island, which is near here, which was excavated by Gard in the 1990s. But there's not much evidence for where people are living in terms of lithic scatters and so on. So the next challenge is to think about that aspect of this landscape, or one of the challenges. And it's actually quite similar to Orkney in many respects, because you've got probably people living, people farming, and also ceremonial monuments all inhabiting the same landscape. So there's quite a kind of complicated pattern of interaction here. This wasn't just a ceremonial complex, it was much more than that, with probably a kind of a resident population who were farming this place for as long as they could. And the other thing that this also leads to is to think about whether we can reevaluate and revisit Machrie Moor as well. And certainly we've been starting to look at Alison Haggerty's excavation archive from Machrie Moor, the possibility of going back and getting lots of new radiocarbon dates, because they've only got 8 radiocarbon dates from all of the work that's been done at Machrie Moor related to the timber monuments, the burials and so on that are there. So there's potential to revisit the archive and do some work on that. And we also know from a Hess geophysical survey that was carried out last year, I think, that there's at least one more stone circle buried within this landscape between two of the sandstone monuments. So this is a landscape that we still haven't really got to grips with either, and there's more potential to go back and look at Machrie Moor, another place where ceremonial monuments and farming was happening in the same kind of place. So that seems to be a real trend in this landscape. So I think the next stages in the process are really to continue to do the analysis of the samples, look at the radiocarbon, get the radiocarbon dates done, and also start to get results from the other forms of analysis and really understand what's going on and when. And this season, we're not going to do any big-scale excavation. We're going to be doing more of a coring sample in a wider landscape, and also do some more environmental testing and analysis and looking for test samples and so on to compare the results against. So there'll be a bit more of a low-key taking stock process over the next 6 months, and then we'll decide what we're going to do in 2025 and whether we're going to go back in with a big trench again, how we're going to make sense of this quite complicated site and landscape. So the Drumadoon cursus is part of the story, but it's much more than that in this landscape, and that's something we'll hope to unpick in the next few years. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Here's some happy team members who have recovered from their excesses. And yeah, and thanks for that. And I'm happy if anyone's got any wee questions they want to ask, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Thanks very much.